はい、皆さん、こんにちは。米国特許セミナーパテントターミノロジーです。このシリーズでは、特許用語、表現などをできるだけわかりやすく解説しています。講師は、米国特許弁護士であるブライアン・エプスタインさんです。今回は、今年最後の回で、否定的限定について見ていきたいと思います。否定的限定というのは、文字通り、何々ではないという否定によって発明を限定することを言います。これについて早速ブライアンさんにご解説いただきます。Okay, Brian さん、please share your thoughts on negative limitations.
Sure. So the best way to begin is by discussing what is a negative limitation. So a negative limitation is a claim feature that attempts to distinguish over the prior art by saying how the invention is not the prior art. A basic example might be something like wherein the first area is not adjacent to the second area. A more complicated example might be the semiconductor layer does not cross the light shielding layer. You can tell that these basic negative limitations often use the word not in them. And so the question then is, how did these arise? This is not a common way of claiming inventions. And so typically they arise during prosecution in view of similar prior art. So particularly in crowded, partially mechanical arts like thin film transistors, these kinds of limitations will appear in claims. The reason is that, in mechanical arts, the drawings can provide support for these limitations, right? We're discussing things that aren't necessarily in the words or text of the patent application, and instead might be shown in figures. And, in contrast, it's difficult to illustrate a negative limitation in the algorithm of a software application, right? So, in a software application, you might have several steps in a flow chart. It's more difficult to say that things do not occur in that flow. And we'll go through this again in future slides where we kind of show how these find support in typically in mechanical cases. And so because we're discussing prosecution, this session might be a little irrelevant to translators. The point of patent terminology is mostly to focus on translation. We do have some tips at the end for translators, but because this is mostly about prosecution, this is more for Bedrishi or other foreign patent attorneys. But still, I do know that these limitations can occur in original filings, so I hope all of our translators stay with us until the end.
はい、ここまでの解説を簡単にまとめますと、通常、否定的限定というのは、機械分野などで、多くの発明が密集しているところで起こりやすく、また、プロセキューションですね、つまり、審査の段階で使われることが多いということでした。で次に、否定的限定の例を一つ挙げてみていただきたいと思います。So, Brian, could you give an example of a negative limitation?
Yeah, sure. So this is an example of an invention and some prior art. For those of you that saw my U.S. prosecution study group session 9, these figures will look very familiar. So on the left is an image of applicant's invention. Here you can see a finger moves through this key area alpha across a boundary and into the key area beta. And on the right is the applied prior art. So here, a finger moves from the operation button 24A through this border area here, and then onto operation button 24B. All right, so what kind of negative limitation can we write here? Or did the applicant write? So this is paraphrased from, again, an actual prosecution. They wrote something like, providing a tactile sensation upon detecting that the position of the finger slides from a first area into a second area without passing through a third area not corresponding to an input object. So this is kind of an interesting example because there are two negative limitations. The first negative limitation relates to how the position of the finger slides between the first and the second areas, right? This is this without passing through a third area portion. The second negative limitation attempts to define the third area. And we're doing that by saying that this is a third area not corresponding to an input object, right? We're basically saying we don't pass through this border area between the two operation buttons.
はい、この例をまとめますと、先行技術との差別化のために、入力エリアに対応していない第3エリアという、否定的限定と、第3エリアを通過することなくという否定的限定を使用しています。はい、次に、こういった否定的限定は、不明確にならないかについて聞いてみたいと思います。So, Brian さん、what about indefiniteness of negative limitations?
Sure. So historically, negative limitations were considered indefinite. This goes back to really old laws in the US, and these were kind of summed up in 1953, so about 70 years ago, when they said a claim is indefinite when all the applicant does is claim everything, whether known or unknown, except that which is shown in the prior art. Okay, that was the state of the law back then. And that was this kind of limitation was considered indefinite as a result. However, over time, this view evolved because the negative limitation itself is still indefinite. So an example is this Bankowski case just 10 years later. The idea then was that, okay, the negative limitation itself is definite. And so although it's quite broad, we know what it means. Still, you will see examiners make these rejections under what in modern times is 35 USC 112B. These examiners might be incorrect, but they're still allowed to make this rejection, and you still have to address this viewpoint. However, currently, negative limitations are attacked under a different provision. So this comes up under 112A for failure to comply with the written description requirement. And there's a particular site to the MPEP here. And this, we're not going to go too in detail with what the MPEP says about negative limitations, but the most important practice tip from that MPEP section is this idea that the mere absence of a positive recitation in the specification is not a basis for an exclusion in the claim. Okay. And so this is maybe better illustrated with an example. This is kind of what I was getting at earlier in our session when I discussed the flowchart for a software invention, where it's a little difficult to read in things that do not occur. So here's an example of this. So if our application is silent about this area between alpha and beta, right, there's this border here, then we might not have written description support for a third area not corresponding to an input object, right? This is what we mean. But if our application doesn't have that in there, then we don't have written description support to describe an area not corresponding to an input object. It's just, our application's silent with regard to a positive limitation. Our application is silent with regard to a negative limitation. And so it's just something we cannot claim.
はい、ここまでの解説では、否定的限定というのは、不明確性が問題になることはあまりなく、その代わりに記載要件を満たしているかどうかが問題になるということでした。つまり、クレームに記載の否定的限定について、明細書にサポートがあるかどうかが問題になるということでした。次に、否定的限定の他の問題が、他の例があるかどうかについて聞いてみたいと思います。So, Brian-san, are there any other examples of negative limitations?
Yeah, sure. So, we've been discussing these ones where we say, without or not. And so, some classic negative limitations are other than or devoid of or excluding. In particular, one of the most common ones I see in modern times are phrases like irrespective of and independent of. These are phrased positively, right? When we look at things like other than or devoid of or excluding, these are or not or without. These are all negative words. It's very clear that this is a negative limitation, and examiners are going to start examining them for all of these for statutory compliance, whether it's indefiniteness or written description or some other issue. A lot of attorneys now will try to use these phrases like irrespective of or independent of. These sound positive. They are ultimately negative limitations, though, so they should be examined in the same way. But, we're going to come back to this point in another slide or two. So let's talk about some potential issues with negative limitations. So the first is that, even if the USPTO will accept the scope of a negative limitation, maybe they're fine with it saying excluding, or maybe they're fine with something that says independent, negative limitations still might be unsuitable for the applicant. And so the first reason why is that the BRI, the broadest reasonable interpretation of a negative limitation, usually is quite broad. So let's look at our example again. So we've got this feature of without passing through a third area not corresponding to an input object, right? Again, in this prior art, the way it was set up in the office action, is, or in the office action is that, this is the first area, this is the second area, and we're trying to move between, in our application, these two adjacent areas, alpha and beta, right? They don't have this border area between the operation buttons. And so, again, the applicant, the hypothetical applicant, introduced this phrase of without passing through a third area not corresponding to an input object. But in order to reject that under BRI, the examiner merely needs to do two things. They have to identify first an area not corresponding to an input object. Well, this area over here with the red circle doesn't correspond to an input object. And two, we don't have to pass through the area. Well, if we go from 24A to 24B, we're clearly not passing through this red circle. That's not what the applicant intends, right? But this is still consistent with the broadest reasonable interpretation, because this is an area not corresponding to an input object, and the finger is not passing through it.
はい、否定的限定についての潜在的な問題として、審査官は先行技術において入力エリアに対応していないエリアと、このエリアを通過しないこと、この2つを特定するだけで、この本発明のこれらの特徴を拒絶することができるということでした。では次に、否定的限定について、他に問題があるかどうかについて聞いてみたいと思います。So, Brian-san, are there any other potential issues of negative limitations?
Yeah, sure. So, like, one of the biggest one is that it might be easy to avoid infringement by competitors. So, let's say our competitor is copying our invention here, and they make a little improvement. Okay, their improvement is that, look, when we pass from alpha into beta, when we hit this border here, we momentarily receive no input. And the reason they do it is because the input is uncertain, right? Well, I don't know if I'm in alpha, this portion that's labeled 1. I don't know if I'm in beta, this portion labeled 2. So when we get to this border area, we're just not going to receive any input because it's not clear which one we're supposed to be in. Okay, fine. But now the competitor can argue their finger does pass through an area not corresponding to an input object, right? This area no longer corresponds to an input object. So it's at the third area, and in their invention, they pass through it, and so they don't infringe. And so this is a big risk for applicants when they use negative limitations, right? The competitors have a map to figure out how to avoid infringing the patent. Oh,
はい。はい、ここで、もう一つの、否定的限定の問題についてなんですが、この図にあるように、侵害回避が、非常に容易になると、いうことでした。はい。Okay.
So, what can translators do? So, ultimately, they can't do much because the English words should mean what the Japanese words mean, or whatever the source language is. But what they can do is they should try to be consistent with the specification to avoid 112A issues, right? We're going to have a limited ability to support claims in terms of written description. Frequently we are discussing the original. I mean, we are typically discussing the original application at this time. So these are original claims. They'll typically be viewed as being their own written description support. But still, we want to be consistent with the specification because it can also be very difficult for the prosecuting U.S. attorneys or the examiners to understand, how the negative limitations are supposed to map back into the specification, particularly if there's not explicit support for the negative limitation. The other thing that translators can do is try to use positive sounding phrases like independent of instead of negative sounding phrases like excluding. The reason again is that examiners tend to view these more favorably. They tend to create fewer issues, and the meaning should be very similar in some cases, at least, to probably the source language negative limitation. And that concludes us.
はい。ブライアンさん、ありがとうございました。今回は否定的限定について、詳しく解説いただきました。 今回はこれで以上になります。ご質問や扱ってほしいトピックなどがありましたら、YouTube のコメント欄に書いていただくか、スライド最後に記載のメールアドレスまでお気軽にご連絡ください。では本日も、今年もありがとうございました。失礼します。
ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございます。